Our next speaker on the panel is Jonathan Granoff, president of the Global Security Institute and a stalwart in civil society working for nuclear elimination. Jonathan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Fellow panelists, thank you. Your Excellencies, friends, brothers, and sisters. Let us not forget today, UN Day, that the very first resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations in January of 1946 called for the elimination of nuclear weapons and other weapons adaptable to mass destruction. And on United Nations Day 3 years ago, the Secretary General set forth a compass point for international cooperation to eliminate nuclear weapons, and through advocacy of a series of incremental steps that reduce the threat, to make the world safer on the path to this achievement. This 5-point proposal represents the kind of bold leadership that is needed to fulfill the aspiration so eloquently expressed by President Obama as, quote, the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons, which will constitute, in the words of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, a global public good of the highest order. Failure to achieve rapid progress in fulfilling this moral and practical imperative will result in cynicism toward the most important tool the world presently has to ensure peace: solemnly negotiated and agreed upon commitments. Without such explicit commitments, conventions, and treaties, we rely upon ad hoc arrangements which are only as strong as short-term perceived interests of states. With treaties, norms are set and common purposes achievable. The term in international law to remember is pacta sunt servanda. Agreements must be kept and honored in good faith. Or, in the words of President Obama, words must mean something. The 2010 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review's final statement contains a reaffirmation of, quote, unequivocal undertaking to accomplish, not just to aspire, but to accomplish the total elimination of nuclear weapons. It calls upon states to undertake concrete disarmament efforts, in fact, quote, special efforts to establish the necessary framework to achieve and maintain a world without nuclear weapons. It highlights that this is a matter that requires our most committed actions by saying there is an urgent need. Urgent, concrete, unequivocal. These are strong words requiring strong actions. Many of us were heartened by the attention paid to the progressive 5-point agenda of the Secretary General's proposal included in the final statement, and particularly the reference to a convention or a framework of instruments to achieve the elimination of nuclear weapons. For without such clarity of purpose, the dynamism required to achieve significant threat-reducing steps will be difficult to obtain. Today, we are seeing how difficult it is just to achieve the very modest incremental steps such as a fissile material treaty or the strengthening of IAEA safeguards, or even entry into force of the Test Ban Treaty. The galvanizing effect of collectively seeking the common goal of a nuclear weapons-free world will make all the steps needed to move there so much easier and clearer. In the recent United States Nuclear Posture Review, there is a, quote, commitment to a nuclear weapons-free world. And there is even a commitment, quote, to initiate a comprehensive national research and development program to support continued progress toward a world free of nuclear weapons, including, but not limited to, expanded work on verification technologies. What have we seen since these commitments have been made? Nearly every state with nuclear weapons seems to be upgrading, expanding, or modernizing their weapons. For example, in the United States, as part of the negotiations for obtaining the START Treaty, new commitments were made to allocate potentially over $200 billion to modernize the arsenal, modernize delivery systems, modernize weapons. There may be some commitment to initiating a comprehensive national research and development program, as called for in the Nuclear Posture Review, but if any funds have been allocated to this task, they are dwarfed by the commitment to modernize the arsenal. The language of the final statement of the NPT Review Conference is very consistent with initiating a comprehensive research and development program on disarmament at an international level. And if anything is needed now, it is a clear, unambiguous, unequivocal, irreversible, well-funded effort by like-minded states, or all states, on laying out the framework necessary to obtain and maintain a nuclear weapons-free world. There is no ongoing forum in which nuclear disarmament is being discussed and advanced on a daily, regular, systematic basis. There's language, there are statements, but we do not see the institutionalization. We don't see the commitment being operationalized, and that's what's needed now. Without such a course of action, we become subject to backsliding. The ongoing debate should be continually about how to get rid of nuclear weapons. Yet continually we are forced to return to the argument whether we should get rid of nuclear weapons. That argument should have been laid to rest in 2000 when the unequivocal undertaking to elimination was made at the NPT Review Conference. And we all know we will be faced with bureaucracies, think tanks, and politicians who will force us to revisit the argument whether we should get rid of nuclear weapons again and again unless we lay out the framework or proceed to negotiate the preparatory process for a nuclear weapons convention. Some people say working on a framework or convention is a distraction from the NPT. The NPT contemplates subsidiary instruments to fulfill its non-proliferation purposes. Why not its disarmament purposes? Nobody argues that a test ban is a distraction from the non-proliferation purposes of the NPT, or a fissile material cutoff treaty is a distraction. The NPT clearly contemplates subsidiary instruments. We need subsidiary instruments to achieve non-proliferation goals and likewise to achieve disarmament goals. It is to fulfill the disarmament pillar of the NPT that a framework of agreements or a convention is needed. Some people say there are many preconditions to beginning this process. There seems to be a proliferation of preconditions. For some, the precondition is the elimination of bad people. For others, it's the elimination of bad states. For others, it's a utopian world in utter harmony. But there is no language in the final statement of the NPT Review or in the NPT itself, no language in the United States Nuclear Posture Review or any other country's review that there are preconditions to beginning this process of making progress to move toward negotiating the elimination of nuclear weapons. There's no legal basis for this position, and there is substantial legal basis for commencing the process of negotiations now. There appears to be three paths before us. One is ad hoc incremental steps with numerous preconditions before actually commencing the real work of negotiating disarmament. Two, begin the creation of a comprehensive framework that incorporates both incremental steps but ensures the clarity of purpose of disarmament, thus forming a basis to critique diversions from the disarmament process and a context to integrate many programs and approaches. Three is a direct fast track toward a convention with prompt commencement of a preparatory process leading to negotiations as early as possible. I think the latter two are much preferred, and the ad hoc incremental approach is proving too slow. I believe that what can drive this process is the understanding that nuclear weapons are morally, culturally, and humanely repugnant. Imagine if the Biological Weapons Convention said that no country can use polio or smallpox as a weapon, but we will permit 9 countries to use the plague as a weapon. We recognize the plague is unacceptable. It is not legitimate, legal, or moral for any country, good or bad, to threaten to use such a weapon. Such conduct would violate our most basic standards of humanity, and clearly international humanitarian law. That is why the inclusion of international humanitarian law in the final statement of the NPT review last year was so important. This is an area for nuclear disarmament advocacy that should be utilized very forcefully. International humanitarian law, the body of law that governs the use of force in war, prohibits the use of weapons that are unable to discriminate between civilians and combatants. It necessitates that all weapons must be proportionate to specific military objectives. The weapons must not cause unnecessary or aggravated suffering, even to combatants. They must not affect states that are not parties to the conflict. And they must not cause severe, widespread, or long-term damage to the environment. The International Court of Justice, in its landmark advisory opinion on the legality of nuclear weapons, highlighted the fact that it is impossible to control nuclear weapons in space or time. Indeed, one can, with great effort, imagine certain uses that would be compliant with international law. A depth charge on the high seas would do so. A small nuclear weapon in a desert might do so, but the vast majority of missions and deployments of nuclear weapons are not those exceptions. The vast majority of deployments and missions of nuclear weapons would violate international humanitarian law. And that highlights the need to operationalize creating the framework of instruments needed to eliminate the weapons or begin the preparatory process for a convention now. The threat covers every person on the planet, every state, not just nuclear weapon states, and thus every state has a duty to seize this issue. There are no good reasons to wait and many good reasons to commence now. The global economy has become one fabric. Today, as never before, we are communicating ideas, passions, art without borders. We share a common climate, common oceans, and it is time we realize that we share a common future. The security of our children deserves global security with multinational cooperation based not on ad hoc arrangements, but on the rule of law. When it comes to nuclear weapons, the pursuit of national self-interest must not be distorted by the provincialism of national myopia. Realism requires common efforts. It is in the interest of every nation to work to eliminate nuclear weapons. We live in one world. It is time we started living in a civilized fashion. As the late Senator Alan Cranston used to say, nuclear weapons are unworthy of civilization. We have to work together to get rid of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.